Pause here for, there we go. Just wanted to make sure the webinar was being recorded, and thank you, Kathy. Um, so again, welcome and good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's joining us here today. Again, my name is Jose Juan Lara Jr. I go by he, him, his, and I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And for those of you who are not familiar with APIGBV, we are a national culture-specific resource center on domestic violence and sexual assaults and all forms of gender-based violence impacting the Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, Middle Eastern, North African communities. So needless to say, at API-GBV, we represent the global majority. As such, we have that title as a National Culturally Specific Resource Center based on our funding through the Office on Violence Against Women. And we hold that 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 title with a handful of other culturally specific national resource centers, also funded under the Office of Violence Against Women. And so we provide all forms of training and technical assistance, one of them being around language access. And I am part of the language access team. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you here today. And for those of you who have joined us through the webinar series, welcome back. And for those of you who this is the first time joining us, welcome. Excited for you to be here. As Kathy mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and someone from CCASA will interject and let us know if there's a question. And we'll try to respond to those questions as we have this conversation. So with that said, I just want to welcome Sabrina and Liam again into this conversation. Thank you for joining us to have this amazing conversation. And I just want, before we continue, I just want to remind us that quite often when we talk about language access, we often just default and focus on spoken language. And we often forget people who use different modes of communication. And so at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, when we talk about language access, we contextualize it from the aspect of being inclusive of all forms of mode of communication and linguistic diversity. So I just want to mention that before we start. With that, I want to give an opportunity for Sabrina and Liam to give a little bit more about who they are, where they come from. So we'll just start with you, Sabrina. Just tell us your origin story.
Yeah, no problem. Well, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Rolt. I'm currently executive director with Dove, which is Deaf Overcoming Violence Through Empowerment. And I have worked with Dove now for 6.5 years. I started as a program director. I did that for 4 years, and I've been the executive director for 2.5 years now. I've worked in the domestic violence field for that amount of time as well, 6.5 years. Prior to that, I was heavily involved as a social worker. I also did case management work, and I've worked in those fields. And I've been in social services and the social service field off and on for over 15 years now. And Dove itself is, I want to talk a little bit about exactly what Dove is and how it's important for us all to know. And so we know where this communication and this information is coming from in the work that we do in the state of Colorado. So Dove is a nonprofit 501c3 organization based in Colorado. And we provide statewide services to those who are experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault, specifically within the community of the deaf and hard of hearing, deaf, blind, and deaf and disabled communities. And you may be wondering why we specifically target those communities, because those communities typically don't have access to services. They don't have culturally responsive or culturally appropriate services. So our team and our staff all identify as deaf or deaf and disabled within our organization right now. So we all use ASL, American Sign Language, as our primary language. So we have that cultural understanding to best work with our deaf survivors who are experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault, and what their cultural needs may be, how it can look different within the deaf community, and what kind of services folks may need, providing communication access. So we have that niche, if you will, and now that specialized knowledge within our organization to make us unique compared to other organizations within the state of Colorado. We are a team of 5 advocates, and again, we're statewide, and we serve approximately, I would say, 90 victims annually within the state of Colorado. And we provide various services. I'll talk a little bit more about that during the presentation today, but really I look forward to being here. I look forward to answering any questions that may come up for all of you. And I appreciate having this open dialogue with everyone. I think it's a really important topic that isn't mentioned, or as Jose Juan said, can be overlooked. So it's great that we're having this open conversation in a safe space for everyone. No question is not big enough to ask or strange to ask. Please ask. I would like to learn something and share my knowledge with all of you. So thank you so much for having me here. I'll turn it over to you, Liam.
Great. This is Liam signing. Thank you so much, Sabrina. It's always lovely to be in community with you. I am Liam Esposito. I use he, him pronouns, identify as white, deaf, autistic, trans man. I've been in this anti-violence movement work for 25 years in different roles, from being a board member to an advocate to a volunteer, executive director. I did the work that Sabrina's now doing for Colorado. I did that in Rochester, New York for a group called Ignite. As Sabrina mentioned, she's going to talk more about anti-violence work in our community. I will provide more of a national lens, because as Sabrina mentioned, working with Dove, it's a unique program and services in Colorado to support deaf survivors, because ASL, right? ASL advocates. That's why we call it for by deaf services. I'm excited about that part. I have to get myself back here. But I currently work with Activating Change. We are a national organization that provides and focuses on ending victimization, criminalization, and institutionalization of deaf people and people with disabilities. We work to end mass incarceration. We work to end violence within communities. We work really toward collective healing for all and liberation for all. Activating Change provides technical assistance and training in different projects, including we work with disability grant program, also with deaf programs. We provide technical and training assistance for all 4 by deaf programs in the nation, supporting their services and their boards. I work closely with 20-ish 4 and by deaf programs. Also, I am involved with a new national project that we call Deaf Survivor Services. And we are in the planning phases for about a year now. We will be launching the first ever of its type, a national virtual service line for deaf survivors to close the gap that's currently throughout the country for deaf folks without services. So I'm excited about that. So that's a little bit about myself and about our program. I'll turn it back to Jose Juan.
So thank you, Liam and Sabrina, for giving us a little bit about who you are, where you come from. And again, just thank you for being here today with us to have this conversation, this dialogue. So Sabrina, I'm going to start off with you. I'm a sociologist by education, and so to me, when I talk about having been an advocate for 25 years and now learning more about the intersections and cultural identity, I think a lot of times before we can talk about how we can support certain communities, we really have to go back to the isms of the conversation, right? And just like in any situation, when we're trying to enhance access to survivors from different walks of life, especially for survivors who may be part of the deaf and hard of hearing communities, audism is a thing. And so I want to ask you, Sabrina, if you can briefly explain audism and its impact on deaf survivors of domestic and sexual violence.
Yeah. And that's a great question, especially to open up this conversation with talking about autism, because that term is often overlooked and does not come up when we're talking about the different isms. We typically don't see autism included in that conversation. So within the deaf community, that term is discussed often. We talk about it all the time. And I think it's really important to highlight what autism exactly is and what that impact can look like on survivors who identify as deaf within the deaf community. So, really, autism means discrimination and being prejudiced against people who identify as deaf or deaf and disabled, hard of hearing, deaf blind. And so the prejudice and discrimination really happens every single day within our lives. You don't have to be a survivor to experience that. Myself, as normal community member, and Liam, I'm sure you experience this autism as well because it's system wide. It's the system is based on people who can hear. So that means you go into a grocery store, you go into a gas station, you go into any public space, and communication is automatically going to be a barrier. People that for the first time they might meet a deaf person, they don't know how to communicate with them, or they might view a deaf person as not knowing what to do. And so that right there creates a bit of an uncomfortable oppression for a deaf person. So imagine you have people who experience domestic violence on top of that, and they're going through the system. The system itself is already oppressive. And so you have that additional communication barrier and that gap when you're a survivor trying to get services. And so that experience for the deaf survivor is amplified when we're talking about autism. So in the system, we can be talking about medical system, criminal justice system, within law enforcement. All of these various systems that we interact with are hearing based, and they don't allow for accessibility within those spaces. So when you have a survivor who is looking for immediate, care, support, services, the communication is not offered to them. There's no cultural responsiveness. And so often they don't feel safe going into those spaces to get the services that they need. And so that is where autism impacts us all. And often when we have a survivor who's trying to get support, the communication is not provided, the access is not provided. So then that person is sent to their unhealthy relationship or to the violent situation, they're sent back to that. And so really is increased risk for everything that's happening to them. And it's impacting their ability to receive effective services, their ability to find safe housing, to find shelter, to find support and advocacy that they may need. So it feels like it's not accessible at all. They're in a whole other world. And then that creates more trauma, that creates distrust. And so autism is a very important term for us to be aware of and something for us to keep in the back of our minds when we're working with survivors, especially as hearing advocates. And you may work with deaf survivors. You may not realize that privilege that you have that your survivors may not have, making it inequitable. So it's important for us to empower our survivors and let them take the lead, figure out what they need and what supports they need and want, what they're looking for, and sort of instead of thinking, oh, this is a deaf person, let me help. No, empower them to tell you and inform you as to what they need and help build that trust that sometimes and often is taken away from folks as they're growing up.
Thank you, Sabrina. And oh, Liam, sorry.
I may add, if I may, just to add a couple thoughts. This is Liam signing. Thank you, Sabrina. That was a beautiful definition. I think it gives this frame of autism, and I think it might be nice to supplement with some concrete examples of how it shows up in our work to connect your beautiful description with concrete examples. And a couple come to mind for me in terms of how autism shows up in our work. It could be as simple or minor as asking a hearing person, whether they work as a service provider in the hospital, I mean, whatever their position is, a hearing person asking a deaf person, do you read lips? So you're asking a deaf survivor or a deaf advocate if we can read lips. That is a form of autism. You are expecting us to follow the norms that Sabrina talked about of a very phonocentric and audiocentric society. So that starts the power dynamics off as hearing and audiocentric norms being in control. Now, when I was in Rochester, New York, I worked with Advocates for Ignite, and I remember going to court with a survivor. They were they were asking for an order of protection. So we went in, the survivor was in the waiting room filling out some paperwork. We let the front desk know that we were here, wanting an order of protection, that we're both deaf, and we requested an American Sign Language interpreter. And we waited and waited. Maybe after 2.5 hours, an interpreter finally arrived. Now, during that 2.5 hours that we were waiting, and now the interpreter had gotten a call and came 2.5 hours later. And I want to come back to the system, right? It's the system. It's the court that needs to be more mindful and more proactive with making sure that everything in the legal process is accessible. And I can talk more about that later when we talk about recommendations, but it's not the interpreter's fault. It's not, it wasn't our fault. It's the system, right? So when we then were in that process waiting, everybody else that was coming in went ahead and got services, right? We were still stuck on step one. And the reason we were stuck on step one is because we did not have access to services, because it's a very audio-centric spoken language service. But everybody else was coming in, getting their order of protection, while the deaf survivor was waiting for 2.5 hours to even just proceed from step one. And then you have more process that you have to wait for even more accessible services. So that is what, right, deaf survivors go through all the time. And sometimes they're like, I have to deal with that. Forget it. I'm going home. It's not even worth the effort to fight and navigate the system and be re-traumatized or traumatized from audism and hearing service providers, right? It is very traumatic. Sometimes I think deaf survivors would rather experience the trauma they experience in, their familiar home environment.
Yeah, and this is Sabrina. That's why I also wanted to mention that statistics show deaf survivors of violence are more likely to experience abuse because they are not able to report. They're maybe trying to file for an order of protection. And like Liam mentioned, they get stuck. And so they just feel, oh, okay, I'll go back to that relationship. Maybe I can report that person at some other point, and the cycle just continues. It just continues. And it's a very big reason why domestic violence and we're a small community. The deaf community is small, but statistics show that we're much more likely to be survivors to experience these kind of situations because we don't have the services and support that we need for people to be able to do things independently, and to make those reports independently. And it's really a failure of the system as well.
So thank you, Liam and Sabrina, for contextualizing, giving us examples of how autism is reflective and how as us as advocates or hearing advocates can contribute to that barrier. So speaking of barriers and services, Sabrina, I want to ask you, kind of give us more context, like what main barriers prevent deaf survivors from seeking services and support? You've kind of given some story, but I was wondering if you can give us more examples from that aspect.
Well, really, as I mentioned before, it's the system. Everything is a barrier within the system. But as far as main barriers go, I would say a lack of communication access in shelters. When you have a deaf survivor who is leaving that situation, they are typically looking for shelter. That's the first thing they're looking for, right? It doesn't matter if they're deaf or hearing. A hearing person can go into a shelter more easily. They can make the phone calls. They can go in, see if there's availability, that sort of thing. They don't need an interpreter often, unless, of course, they speak another language. But typically, if you're talking about speaking English, they're able to access the shelter and get the services and do the intake process and whatnot, get the support groups. case management, whatever they may need. However, if you have a deaf survivor trying to call a shelter, you sometimes see barriers right away. For example, when they're trying to make a phone call, they have to go through, if they're calling a domestic violence shelter, often the shelters will say, hey, we can't use an interpreter. It's a third party when you're trying to make a phone call. I need to speak to you directly. But as a deaf person, you are speaking directly to them. That is the only way, that's the only form of communication they have is to go through an interpreter. And that's through a video relay service, which is called VRS, which goes through an interpreter. And so automatically you have a barrier right there. And it's a frustrating experience for folks having to do that. So then let's say you have someone trying to get into a safe place. We've also noticed a common barrier, or challenge, I can say, for survivors when they're trying to call through VRS into a shelter. Sometimes the VRS interpreter is not qualified to interpret that, so you'll have a very big miscommunication between the hearing shelter intake person and the deaf person. The intake person will typically deny the deaf person calling in because of the communication, and it's not the deaf person's fault. Sometimes what will happen is the deaf person will feel frustrated, so maybe they'll contact a deaf DV organization such as Dove, and we'll say, there are DV shelters out there, and there are services out there that you can access, and then we will then work with the victims or survivors to help them find a shelter to ensure that the intake process goes well, they have communication, everything's clear, and the survivor's able to get in and get the services that they need for the shelter. But the barriers are still there. So say they get into the shelter, they have a case management appointment, they're in a support group. They want to participate with other survivors in the activities. Typically, interpreters are not provided for that kind of thing. So the deaf person feels left out, and they're not able to then receive more services. Communication is not clear, and they end up feeling not comfortable within the shelter environment. The communication is not there. They feel like no one understands me. They don't understand my needs. And often they'll want to leave the shelter space. And then where are they going to go? They typically go back to the place that they originally left. And that is the big challenge that we have within the shelter spaces. And that's one thing that I can talk about. Another thing Liam mentioned was that within the judicial system, it's not accessible, right? Because everything is hearing based, audio based, where you go, how you fill out the forms that you need, they're all English based. And deaf people, typically English is not their first language, so they struggle to translate between ASL and English filling out forms. So that is a big barrier. As we all know, legal jargon can be very complicated, and it can be a very overwhelming experience for a deaf person. And so often when you have someone trying to go in for a protection order, as was mentioned, it'll typically happen the same day, but we often don't have interpreters available at the last moment. So that means you have a delay right there, even asking for the request, waiting for an interpreter to do. So what do they do that night? Do they go back home? Do they go back to the place where they don't feel safe? What can they do? So that is a very big challenge that we face. And we see that often happen when they contact Dove. They'll ask us for a hotel stay for the night. We want to ensure that they're in a safe space until they're able to go back the next day to the courthouse in order to get an interpreter and fill out those forms, in order to get the protection order and have the communication access that they need. And so as a deaf person, and again, this is not for all deaf people. Some deaf people might need CDIs, which are certified deaf interpreters, to come along with them. And in Colorado, we only have around 3 CDI certified deaf interpreters within the entire state, which is another big challenge because we have some deaf individuals who may go to court. They're trying to file for protection order, but the ASL interpreter is more English based, and the communication is going to be difficult. So at times we can't get a CDI to go into court right in that moment. And sometimes your first interpreter might not be able to fully understand the deaf person. It can affect your ability to get a permanent protection order, court proceedings. Maybe you can only get a temporary protection order. There are a lot of things involved that will have direct impact on a deaf person, and that will create ongoing barriers. So imagine if you're experiencing that already. Would you then want to go back to the court to file for protection order? Would you want to continue to have limited access and confusing experiences in the court? And so there are just layers of trauma and layers of audism that directly impact deaf folks trying to access help. Another barrier I wanted to mention is law enforcement. When you're trying to call 911 for someone to show up, law enforcement typically does not bring a sign language interpreter with them. So often communication is going to look like having to write back and forth, or some people don't feel comfortable reading lips, so they'll want to write back and forth, and that's a communication barrier again with English. As I mentioned, often law enforcement won't call an interpreter or say it's 2 o'clock in the morning or an interpreter's not available. So the whole communication process is very traumatizing for a deaf person. And often they don't have trust and a great relationship with law enforcement because of that barrier in communication. And so if a law enforcement does show up from that 911 call, you'll have hearing privilege right there. And often law enforcement will talk to the hearing person who's involved more than they'll speak to the deaf person, and they'll neglect or ignore the deaf person who maybe made the initial phone call to 911, who the statement and everything is going to go through the person who can hear and who can speak. And that might be the abuser. And so when you're getting that statement, it's not going to be an honest statement because it's not coming from the person who is being victimized and the survivor and the person who called 911 in the first place. And so typically they won't call 911 again. They'll try to figure it out on their own. They'll try to figure out a different situation and resolve it themselves instead of calling law enforcement to be involved. And so when you have a deaf person who's outside trying to get support into with the shelter or advocacy services, sometimes the hearing person won't understand deaf culture. They won't understand the communication needs, which can cause a barrier in itself. They won't have that common knowledge base of what the deaf person may be trying to say. And so for a deaf person or for an advocate, maybe you might think that's not, it might be misperceived of what the deaf person is trying to say. And there can cause some disconnect between the deaf person trying to communicate what their ideas are, their priorities are, what their beliefs are, and maybe a hearing advocate or law enforcement or whoever it may be within the hearing system not really being able to make those connections with the deaf person, which causes another layer of frustration for deaf folks. And so deaf people, as we mentioned before, will use VRS, video relay services, to make phone calls. And that's really the only way we can make outside calls to people who don't sign. So if you have your abuser or you have someone who maybe damaged that phone, maybe the iPhone, the video phone, or the remote, then that means a deaf person can't make a phone call out. They can't call 911. They can't call a family member in to help, or a friend, or a neighbor, or anything like that. So the ability to communicate to the outside hearing world is incredibly limited or completely cut off. And they aren't able to get the support that they need because they don't have that hearing privilege being a deaf person. And so often you will see within the power control relationship that hearing person or the person who has some hearing then has control over the video phone. They have control over being able to make calls out, and they won't allow the deaf person to make calls out or to communicate or to call 911. And so you have no access to be able to make any independent calls. It's been completely taken away. Another thing I wanted to add that I feel is very important to share as well is because deaf people sometimes are not able to find work, often in the hearing environment, the work environment is not accessible, or they won't hire a deaf person because they'll be perceived as not being intelligent, or they're not a good fit for that workplace, so they're not able to work independently. So a lot of times people will stay home. They'll maybe be the home giver, the home taker. Maybe they'll collect SSI or SSDI. They'll take care of the kids because they're in that power control relationship, and their partner's the one who might have control over the money, the SSI and the SSDI, and they might take it, or the person will be afraid to leave because their abuser has access to the financials and they have all the financial control. And so because of that, they'll feel unable to do anything. They continue to stay in that relationship because it's financial stability. And maybe they don't realize that they can call SSI, they can call and talk about fraud. They don't know their rights often. And so really there are a lot of layers involved. Um, with a deaf person going through various barriers and factors to trying to leave, the relationship then causes them to feel stuck even longer. And so we'll talk more about that later, the cultural factors within the deaf community. I know we'll talk about that later, but there are a lot of cultural factors that contribute to additional reasons that the community feels not able to ask for help or to talk about. I know we'll talk about this a little bit later on. But out in the community, there are a lot of barriers that do contribute to deaf people feeling helpless and feeling wanting to get help, but not knowing that they're able to get access, or being unsure if they're able to get access to the supports that they need, and maybe not seeing eye to eye with folks outside of the deaf community who don't sign. And maybe they don't have the budget to be able to pay for an interpreter themselves. I mean, there are so many things that impact a deaf person and so many layers that contribute to that as well.
So,
Liam, did you want to add anything to that response?
This is Liam signing. I mean, you just beautifully stated so much. I don't think I have anything to add. I did want to comment on the last part, especially, Sabrina, especially, hearing services and providers and budgets. So they don't often have a line item in their budget for communication access. And so often it's not noticed. I mean, I think many hearing organizations have their heart in the right place. They authentically care and want to support deaf survivors. And there's also a recognition that they are not prepared. They are not prepared. They don't know where to start. They don't know where to look for interpreters. How do they determine the qualification of those interpreters if they do find them? So that sort of leads me to a follow-up question that I have on what Sabrina was talking about, is that deaf folks often, right, like they'll have to leave and then come back because interpreters aren't available. I want to really emphasize that it's not the fault of interpreters. Most interpreters, right, there's sort of two, let's see, there's two ways you can get interpreters. You can contract through an agency, right? So it might be a local sign language interpreter agency that has a certain pool of interpreters, or you can contract directly with an interpreter. They might be considered a freelance interpreter and they wouldn't work through an agency. So those are two common ways to work with interpreters. Now, what happens is if you directly contract with a freelance interpreter, availability is going to look different, right? An interpreter who is contracting, they may have several contracts. They don't have typical 9-to-5 jobs. They make their own schedule and their own availability. They have their own needs as a human being, right? With their own family, etc. So understanding that impact coming from a freelance work perspective, right? Unless you are scheduled ahead of time, they're not sitting waiting for a call, right? They're busy. They have other contracts, they have work, so they need more advanced notice. And survivors don't have that time. They don't know ahead of time when a crisis is going to happen, right? They can't predict when they're going to need an interpreter. So you see, inherently is a challenge navigating a crisis situation with the availability of interpreters. So that's one thing I'd like to mention. Another thing related to how we support our ASL interpreters to be qualified for the work. That is another whole area. Because if you look at this webinar, for example, some of the folks in the audience are listening or watching this webinar and think, oh, these interpreters are great. The interpreters are doing the work. I have access to this. This is what every deaf person's experience is with interpreters. No, that's not the case. This is actually a unique situation. First of all, Jose Juan is an excellent model. He asked Sabrina and I for our preferred interpreters. That was the first thing that happened. That is great practice, and it should be common practice. Always ask a deaf person if they have a preference for communication and for interpreters. So we suggested our preference of Stacy and Brielle. Now, Sabrina has been working with Brielle. They have a relationship. I have worked with Stacy for several years. We have a previous relationship. A result of those relationships is effective communication for all of you in very different ways than if we had never met the interpreters before today. If it was the first time we had met the interpreters, this is not the type of communication you would be receiving. You might still follow along, you might still get the understanding, but the flow would not be the same. The way that we were represented would not be the same because the foundation of connection would not be there. The interpreters today have access to more about how we think, how we approach these kinds of presentations. So if you think about this and related to an emergency room situation where triage is happening, in crisis situations, interpreters and deaf people are meeting for the first time. Keep that in mind. Any type of communication issue or misunderstanding that happens, it's not like it's on the interpreter. I mean, sometimes it might be a result of qualifications, but you also have to take a broader look at the dynamic. The dynamic of this affects everybody, the deaf survivor, the deaf advocate, the hearing professionals, the interpreters. It affects everyone, and what adjustments and accommodations need to be happening for everybody in the situation so that the survivor gets the services they need. So back to barriers and that barrier question. Yeah, programs aren't budgeting. They're not budgeted for these kinds of services. When a deaf survivor comes in, we experience the perspective that we're expensive, right? And providers don't have the money to provide us this life-saving service. That's our experience. That is our experience. So we walk away. We don't get the support we need. So first, budget. Also, I think an attitudinal barrier is one I'd like to talk about. Having, so you have tangible barriers, but then you have sort of spiritual and attitudinal barriers. What is a person's attitude toward deaf people? Thinking, do you view us honestly as equals? And if you don't, I would encourage you to unpack it. Do your work. Unpack those thoughts you have about us, those perceptions. Okay, I'm gonna take a pause. I'm gonna take a pause right there.
And this is Sabrina. I just wanted to add a little bit. I know that Liam and I are responding very directly, and that may be a bit heavy for some folks out there, but we want you all to know that we're coming from a good place as deaf people who go through these experiences ourselves, and we see this within our community, and we see this with our victims. We internalize their experiences and we take it all in, and we have trauma ourselves. And so we want to be authentic with the audience, and we want to share with you everything that we've gone through. And I hope that you understand where we're coming from. So I'll turn it back to you, Jose Juan.
And this is the only way we can have these type of conversations, right? How am I supposed to know as an hearing advocate, what am I supposed to learn if I don't believe the community that's telling me this is not working, right? And if we are mindful of that, isn't that just basic advocacy 101, survivor-centered, believing the survivor, believing the communities that when they tell us this is not working for us, believe and trust it's not working, right? So I think again, if we're going to have these conversations, it has to hit where it has to hit. And it's also about accountability as colleagues, as peers, as technical assistance providers doing national work and also embedded in community. Because as Sabrina, like you mentioned, if we're not just advocates or TA providers or technical assistance providers, we're also part of those communities. And so this is not just professional, this is personal, right? Because if it's affecting me as an advocate, and I'm also part of the community, we have to understand the trauma related to that experience. So I'm just looking at time and just going to move us forward in the conversation a little bit. But I really want to go back to statistics because I think sometimes, like you mentioned, Liam, the attitudinal stuff, And for some folks, that's not enough. So let's talk about statistics. And Sabrina, you kind of relate some of those earlier, but can you give us some specific statistics around the impact of gender-based violence as it relates to barriers and so on?
Liam, you want to go?
Sure, this is Liam signing. I don't mind giving some statistics. I think it's always nice to give a general perspective and general picture. Deaf advocates in the United States. Well, first, let me back up. I think even a more basic statistic is in America, about 90% of deaf people are born into families who hear. So what that means is for a high percentage of that 90% of deaf people, many of those people will experience what's called language deprivation, information deprivation, because families who hear do not know sign language. Sometimes they don't learn, often they don't learn American Sign Language. So deaf people are raised in families that, right, they could be expected to speak, to lip read, to all of the types of, right, there's a lot of diversity there. So that basic statistic is important to keep in mind, which means the remaining 10% of deaf people are born into deaf families, and most of those are signing families. Not all of them, but most of them are families who have American Sign Language, and they have access to language and information upon birth. Most of them go to residential deaf schools. They're very involved in deaf communities. So I just want that to be a picture that's painted for you generally in the United States. 90% of deaf people do not experience ease of and access to communication in their home life. And then you have 10% who do, okay, as a general statistic. Now, in the United States, there are a little bit over 12,000 victim service providers in the United States. 12,000 DVSV programs, hearing programs. There are, when you think about deaf programs, there are 20, about 20 for deaf by deaf. And what I mean when I say for deaf by deaf is that the programs were established by deaf people. They are ran by deaf people, like Sabrina is now executive director as a deaf person operating a deaf program. Most of those programs are very small. They could be anywhere from staffed with 1 to 4 people. Most common is 2 staff members. So you have 20-ish of those organizations that are staffed by 2 people. Some of them may only have 1 staff member. So what that means is geographically, right? You take a look at this. Geographically, the red that you see on this map, those signify states that currently are without any for by deaf victim service providers. That translates to almost 65 to 70% of the country geographically is without for deaf by deaf services. And I want to name that because it's a critical statistic to look at and to think about the experience of deaf survivors in this country. And to just know what's out there for us to access is limited. It's challenging. Another statistic for deaf folks that, and like Sabrina mentioned, why deaf folks experience a higher unproportional rate of violence is barriers within the system. They are a contributing factor, but also one of the things that we see a lot of is deaf community members not even realizing that what they experience is a form of violence. They become so comfortable and familiar with it as a way of life And so the education of power control wheel, what domestic violence is, what sexual violence is, and that it's rooted in language it's rooted in having access to language. If you have hearing service providers, so much of the videos out there, the educational material is not accessible. Are you all captioning your videos? Are you all ensuring ASL interpretation? If not, how do deaf survivors have access to that information? How do we even become more informed? How do we become aware of what our options are? So you see where I'm going with this. If those materials aren't available to us, how do we grow our knowledge? How do we become more empowered? So what we've seen with statistics, we've seen different statistics, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 8. I think statistics aside, one is too many. If one person is experiencing violence, it's too much, right? That's at the end of the day. But what I've seen, a lot of my experience with deaf folks is they initially come in to get services, tends to be domestic violence. And then as you get more trust built and rapport built, you see that there's also sexual violence that's happened. It could be child sexual abuse. It could be sexual assault in college. It could be a number of different things, but it comes out, right? And Sabrina, I'm not sure your experience, but in my experience, a lot of deaf folks start sort of as an entry point, having domestic violence as the need for services, because sexual violence is a whole nother layer of incredible trauma that takes a different kind of trust, in my perspective, in terms of the kinds of support folks are searching for and needing after experiencing sexual violence. In my experience, honestly, it's to a point where almost every survivor that we work with has experienced both. So my point is with statistics, I have a love-hate relationship with statistics. I mean, first of all, right, do we ever really know? Do we ever really know statistics? Because I don't think we even have a clear picture of the statistics of deaf folks that use American Sign Language in the United States. It's been elusive for years, even though we have different census and different research, right? So within the population that we are working with, we are very unproportionally matched in terms of how much we experience violence. That's my ultimate point.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on on that, Liam, all the layers that we experience, not just domestic violence, sexual assault, child sexual assault, financial abuse from maybe family preventing access to money and bank accounts and credit cards, and maybe having credit cards in their name, but family members are using them. I mean, there are so different forms of violence in those layers that we're talking about. And the statistics, as you mentioned, they're not acceptable, but sometimes people don't think anything about it. They minimize it and it becomes part of their daily life. They don't think that they can get help for services. They don't realize that it's abuse. And they don't realize that there's a deaf organization out there that can help me. Or maybe they'll get there and they realize that maybe we're not confidential enough, or maybe we're not providing the service that they're exactly looking for, that kind of thing. And maybe when they finally do come to us and get that kind of access and confidentiality, things start to come out. Maybe they start thinking about, oh, my parents wouldn't share information with me. They took my social security. This kind of thing happened when I was a kid. You're right. So a lot of deaf survivors realize things happen much later. And as Liam mentioned, 90% of deaf children are born into families that don't sign, so they have language deprivation right off the bat. And a lot of families don't feel that they need to educate their children on self-advocacy, on their rights, that kind of thing. And so they have everything being spoken, and the child continues to feel more and more put down and put down and put down and feel like they can't do anything for themselves. And then they base their relationships on that. And so oftentimes that will happen and they come in to get support, and this continues into adulthood for a lot of folks.
So I'm wondering, Liam and Sabrina, speaking of statistics, where can people find data that can help their programs, because again, a lot of times our programs are based on funding, and a lot of that is based on the data we can provide the funder to justify why we're, like you mentioned before, Liam, the line item in the budget. So I'm wondering, because I already know the answer to this, but I'm wondering if y'all can give us a sense of, where can our colleagues begin to find that data, and even themselves within their own organizations create a system where they can start collecting that information. So I'm going to go with you, Liam, first from a national perspective, and then Sabrina, I'll just go to you with the same question from an organization, community-based organization. So Liam.
Sure. So this is Liam signing. Of course, we do have data and statistics. They vary, depending on where you look. And I'm happy to share information that we've gathered through the years. Activating change, for example, from our work over the years, we have collected some information. And Jose, I'm happy to send you those briefs that include that data that you can send out to folks who are in the room, or other folks who attend the different parts of the series. For example, I was just looking at Activating Change website related to deaf services, and what we state there is it says 68% of victim services providers report rarely or never serving deaf survivors. 68%. So we did a survey, that we sent out a survey to all service providers. 68% of people who responded said they've never seen a deaf survivor. So my question from that, and my question to you all, is why do you think that is? Why do you think you've never seen a deaf survivor? What is it about your services, your program, your outreach that maybe contributes to that? Oh, yes. Thank you, Kathy, for putting our website up there. I think it might be a good opportunity to reflect on what types of changes might be possible. And then you also might want to look at geographically, right? There may be the geographical area that your service agency doesn't have a large number of deaf people. It doesn't have a large deaf population. That could be the case. That could be. We do have pockets of large deaf communities throughout the United States. And maybe your area is one that doesn't have a deaf community. That could be. But I think the data also shows 1 out of 10 victim service providers reports that they use children of survivors to function as interpreters. So if you have a deaf survivor who is a parent and has an interaction at the hospital or with law enforcement, that hearing service provider looks to the child to know what the deaf parent is saying. And that, oh my goodness, is inappropriate, unethical, and very traumatizing. Do not ever, ever use children as interpreters. Now, I should take a few steps back. If it is an emergency, if it's crisis, absolutely using children as language brokers very briefly, right, to get bits of information, that would be understandable. But it is so important to have access and not rely on children. 23% of service providers report not having sign language interpreters in their area. So that's another thing. So here you see all different parts and pieces to the puzzle, right? We don't just consider the deaf population. We also need to consider contributing factors, the moving parts and the other dynamics. Interpreters are a piece of this puzzle. Providers, how are all of these pieces related? Deaf folks experience domestic violence 2 out of 4. At least in my experiences, 2 out of 4 deaf folks experience domestic violence. Sexual violence on the other hand, it's interesting. I think that number, usually is 2 out of 4, sometimes 3 out of 4. Sabrina, I'm curious what your experience is.
I would say the same statistics with experiencing violence, 2 out of 4. But I would say that the 50% of our entire community, almost half of our community has experienced some form of violence, and not just one time, on multiple occurrences as well. So it really shows that this is a serious problem in the community, that communication is lacking, you're not able to report ongoing traumatization, and that's something that's why we're here. That we want to talk about this. We want to educate. We want to see how we can provide services so that Liam said we don't only have 20% of by deaf, for deaf service providers. That's not enough. Or, excuse me, 20 out of the 12,000. And so we want to bridge that gap. We know that we can provide interpreting services. We have online services, web-based services that we can provide, that you can get services for interpreters if you don't have them in your state or in your area. And so really that's why we're here. We want to have this conversation with everyone here so that we can all work together to bridge those gaps that are out there to ensure that accessibility is improved for deaf people. They can't be ignored. We can't ignore people because those numbers will continue to go up. They will. And our community is so small, it is a very big issue for us that it continues to happen within our community. And in terms of budgets, really, as Liam mentioned, the 68% of folks out there maybe have never seen a deaf survivor, and you're wondering, why do we have that in our budget in the first place? Well, my recommendation would be to have an interpreting line, or instead of calling it that, call it an accommodation line item, so that you can use that for multiple purposes, not only for interpreting services. That way your organization can use that accommodation line for many things. Maybe you have someone who comes up who needs an interpreter. Well, you have that line item in the budget ready. And you don't have to sit there and think, oh, how am I going to do this? What are we going to do? I would suggest you go ahead and create an accommodation line within your budget. If you're not entirely sure of what that could look like and how you could write that in, you can reach out to Dove. And again, this is Colorado specific. I'm not sure about agent of change with Liam and what that would look like for other states and areas. But you can contract with an interpreting agency, and we can help you work through that with activating change. Excuse the interpreter. Um, we can help you to put that in your budget as a line item. So I would suggest you go ahead and read through your information, see how often you might get a deaf person come into a shelter, or how often does that happen once a year? Does it happen every 3 years, 3 times a year? What does that look like for you? And then you can use those numbers to inform your budget item, and so that will fit what your needs may be if you did need to get an interpreter for a survivor. And again, put that in under an accommodation line. So I would suggest using an interpreter if you need it for an hour for maybe a one-on-one interaction, but I would suggest putting it for more than 1 hour with services. So if you have a survivor who wants to participate in, say, group activities or different shelter activities, but they can't because they don't have an interpreter, they feel stuck, they feel left out, you want them to have a similar access to what other hearing survivors would experience. They want to take part in different discussions and conversations. They want to have learning experiences in the shelter, not just while the interpreter's there for that 1 hour. So see if you can have an interpreter available for a support group, for an activity, for other things that may take place within the shelter. Again, not just for the one-on-one advocacy or intake kind of sessions. You want to have your deaf people feel included and not left out just because of money. And there are these little details, little things that you can do to really show that you care and that you're trying to be inclusive instead of feeling like, oh, we can't do that. And I would say you would start that by being proactive. And the way you can be proactive is to show that you're creating space for people. And that can be having the finances there, like having the line item in your budget. And I would start with that. You can then do some analysis, do some data collecting, and figure out what matches your organization best. I understand there are a lot of budget cuts, especially coming up for 2025. Maybe you feel unsure of what that's going to look like. you don't know how that's going to impact your organization and how you can have that accommodation line, again, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share my experience with interpreters. I can give you interpreter agencies who are great to contract with, tell you the difference between a CDI, certified deaf interpreter, versus a DI, a hearing interpreter, talk to you about VRI, video relay services, talk to you about having in-person interpreters as well. We're here for you all. We want to ensure that you all have the education and support that you need so that you're able to advocate and provide for our deaf survivors. They would also benefit from this as well. So it's mutually beneficial to be, and it's a collaborative effort for all of us, and we can all do our part on this.
So Sabrina, you mentioned education. And throughout the conversation, we've been reflective of what can we as advocates, as colleagues who are trying to enhance our access to services to all community members, regardless of their hearing ability and so on. So I want to ask you both, and we'll start with you, Liam, like what types of training and education should service providers receive to increase their competence in advocating with and supporting deaf survivor communities?
This is the okay. So, you came to the right place because Activating Change has amazing offerings. We offer, we have so many different webinars that we offer. Many of those webinars are focused on supporting and capacity building for hearing service providers to meet the needs of deaf survivors. On our website, if you do a search, there's an archive of past webinars that we've offered, courses that we've offered. You can take even, brief courses. We have courses on what Sabrina was just talking about on accommodation lines and budgeting, how you would project numbers, how you would make anticipations for line items and that sort of thing. So there's a short course that you could take and do some practice there. We also have culturally responsive TA courses and webinars. And if you want to have more discussion, you can make an appointment for TA with us to get your questions answered. So I think, ultimately, I encourage folks as much as possible to be in community with the community you want to build relationship with. So, for example, right, hopping into this conversation today, I got a direct message from an audience member who's watching. And it's funny, that audience member used to be in Rochester. I'd never met that person, right? But yeah, it has worked with Ignite and other programs. And as a result of their experience and partnership with that deaf organization in Rochester, now they bring that knowledge and experience with them to where they are now. And then they spread that to what community they're in. So, right, it's beautiful. We become lights. We are lights. We are light workers, right? We learn information, we share information, you bring whatever you learn to the organization and communities you work with. So basically, I think one of the most valuable currency, some of the most valuable currency for you is to be in community. Be in community with our community. Find deaf organizations, find deaf clubs, find deaf events. See if your state even has deaf communities. If you're in Colorado, Dove is there. And I think just, hey, if you think I want to learn about the work you're doing with Dove, what kind of programs are being offered? What can I do to amplify or uplift and help spread light out into our network? Are there any events you're hosting, Sabrina? Are there opportunities? We may have resources or other things that we could use to support your work. Collaborate, connect. We are all interconnected. We are. We are all essentially one. What one of us does impacts the other. So one for all for one, right? As is said. So we're all in this together. We have the same goal. We have the same goal of ending violence and healing for our community. So connect with the community that you want to be in community with, in this case, deaf communities. And also, like Sabrina says, reach out. Feel free to connect with Sabrina. You can also connect with me. Join our monthly webinars. Take our online offerings, any kind of trainings. Work with us in any way. Those would be my suggestions.
And I'll go ahead and add on to that. Regarding trainings, I think it's really important to work with deaf survivors. They're familiar with the communication modalities within the deaf community. They're familiar with what interpreting services should look like, and trauma-informed advocacy within the deaf community, what that may look like. And maybe you occasionally work with deaf survivors, and that's okay. I think it's important, and I encourage you and your team to take some type of training rather than minimize it and put it off. That way you at least have the knowledge and you can take that with you. And that will really show that you're inclusive. You're an inclusive organization, that you're aware of the intersectionalities that are out there. You're aware of various backgrounds. And it's important for us to think about who's being left out, right? Who are the victims? Who are we not thinking about, and try to learn more about them. And at Dove, we also offer various trainings as well. We do cultural considerations trainings. We provide legal workshops with attorneys. We can do them on Zoom. And so you might be wondering what that looks like. We will work with different interpreters to ensure that our survivors have communication access that they need. And we also talk about how sexual violence and domestic violence is different in the deaf community and what situations might typically come up within the deaf community. And if you attend some of these trainings, it'll give you a better idea. And you can then figure out what it might look like for your victims, and give you a more broad understanding, of course, because each situation will be different and we'll have different factors that will come into play, but it'll give you a general idea, help you understand a little bit more about culture, about more common experiences, so that you can provide the best support instead of responding with, oh, I didn't know about this, I didn't know about that. You can educate yourself proactively. And at Dove, we also do offer shelter accommodations. And we do assessments, shelter accommodation assessments. And that looks like, and again, this is only in the state of Colorado. But what that will look like is we will go into a shelter to ensure, and we'll help the shelters ensure that they're accessible for deaf folks. Do they have video phones? Do they have alarms that flash? Are staff aware of the cultural considerations? What are the policies? Are they inclusive for deaf folks? And what would you do if a deaf person were to come in? How would you call an interpreter? What would that look like? And the reason we do this assessment, it might seem minimal, but it's incredibly important because, as we know in this field, we have a lot of turnover with staff. And sometimes it's difficult to retrain everyone. But if you have your policies and procedures in place, once someone leaves and you get new staff members in, it's already there. You don't have to retrain everyone. You don't want your staff to have to look for everything. You want to be as proactive as you can and have everything easily accessible for everyone. And really, this is not least, but it is last but not least, talking about advocacy. Sometimes we feel like we work in silos and our organization is siloed. And really, we need to work together. We need each other. We have to. If not, we're going to have a deaf person who comes up. Maybe they don't use ASL. Maybe they use Spanish or another language. It's okay. We can partner with Spanish speaking organizations and we can provide co-advocacy. And it's not, you don't have to feel siloed. We can work together. As Leah mentioned about active change, we really want to do everything that we can because we care about our clients, we care about our victims, our survivors, and we want to do what's best for them. And the way we can do that is by collaborating, by partnering together to provide resources, knowledge, services, everything that we can to give them the best to our ability, the best services.
And in these last maybe 10 or so 15 so minutes we have together, just want to look to the future and ask you both, and I'll start with you, Liam, again, is like, what are the next steps for enhancing access and support for deaf survivors, and how can the broader community contribute? I mean, you've kind of, both of you kind of mentioned that, but just looking at the future, what does that look like for us as service providers, as colleagues, and so on?
Well, I think it's really up to us. It's up to all of us. What do we want to build? You know? I mean, if you want to continue co-creating together and building together, great. We're here for it. I think, first and foremost is being open-hearted, open-minded, right? As most of us in the work are. We all are. We already come with open hearts and open minds. I try to approach life with as open of a mind and heart as possible. And as we learn, sometimes it requires us to actually unlearn, right? Often our process of learning is unlearning and relearning. Recognizing, okay, this is what we used to do. This is how we used to do it. That no longer serves us in the way it used to. So let's do something different, right? I think as with the human experience, it's just a constant evolution based on the progress of growth that we make at certain points in time. And so, as a deaf survivor myself, as a person in this movement work, I just ask everybody to join with us, to join together and continue to share space and be in community with us and work to end violence. If you have the opportunity for funding, grants, projects, anything, and you're truly interested and want to uplift deaf survivors and our justice experience, consider co-advocacy like Sabrina mentioned. Consider co-advocating with other deaf organizations. Do community outreach together. Work with deaf organizations. I think the more you show up and are visibly in partnership with that community, the community will see you. And the community will see from your actions that you want to work with them. And then it'll go from there.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Liam. Um, Talking about how do you all want to show up? How do you want to be here for the community? We can sit here and talk about all these things and give you all the information, but how you receive that information and what you want to do with the information is key. So I think ultimately it's up to you. We can't twist your arms. We're not here to do that. It's really up to each of us individually to think about what we want to do and what we can do. And maybe you only get one deaf person a year, and that's okay. But how do you want that deaf person to feel when they go into your organization? How do you want them to feel when they receive services? At the end of the day, that's the main point, and that should be the goal for all of our survivors, right? How do you want them to feel? Do you want to create a safe healing space for survivors? And if you do, how can we do that? There are a lot of different identities out there, various experiences, various backgrounds, and how can we ensure that the spaces that people enter feel safe and welcoming? And it's an important thought for each of you to think about, and think about what you feel is important, what you gained from this conversation today, and what you can bring back to your organization and talk to with your team, and think about what we can do together and what your team can do together to improve your organization. Maybe it's contracting with interpreting agencies, providing more access. Maybe it's trainings, maybe whatever it may look like for you. I know in the DV and SV world, sometimes we feel limited. Sometimes we feel we're providing all the services that we can to survivors. We're just, spinning our wheels. But we need to think about how we can improve while we're working at capacity. And really, at the end of the day, that's the ultimate goal. And that's why we're all here. to ensure that our survivors get things as much accessibility as they can, and having the equality as much as we can provide it. And that's why we're all here today. And I can say this over and over and over again. If you're not sure where to start, reach out to Dove, reach out to Activating Change. We are here. We want to have these conversations with you. We can have in-depth conversations. We can provide resources. We can tell you about statistics. We can share our knowledge. We can talk about trainings, all of that. But I want to give you an idea of where to start, and you can always reach out to us.
So we have about 9 minutes left. So I would want to encourage our colleagues who are present here. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. But I just want to kind of summarize our conversation here today, and I'm making a lot of connections, and for me, at the end of the day, it's what you've shared here today, Sabrina and Liam, is just basically fundamental advocacy 101. Is centering the survivor, making sure that they are the ones they are the experts, right? Nothing here that you've shared is nothing different, it's nothing new, other than us being open, adapting to the circumstance, and having a plan of action, right? Because we can express all the sentimentality in the world, but there's also a practical side to the advocacy work that we do. So my question to all of you here present today is, do you have a language access plan? Do you need help developing one? Right? And so that's something that here at API GBV, as well as Activating Change, and I'm sure at Dove, can help us here to develop, right? And it takes time, it takes practice. And also for me, it is still an ongoing learning process. It is learning how to value, like Liam mentioned, the importance of the interpreter in the space, right? And often I have learned that interpreters are not valued for what they bring and what they contribute to the space. Because, and I mentioned this before, when I was a hopeful and young and naive advocate learning and advocating with survivors, I learned about the important role of the judge, the prosecutor, law enforcement, and so on. But no one ever taught me about the importance of an interpreter in that space. No one ever told me about the importance of making sure that what's being shared, the information, the communication, is accessible at all levels of conversation, from mode of communication, from sign to linguistic diversity. I never learned that until later years on and doing this work for 25 years. So I just want to kind of surface that for me. And then in this last, just want to check in with Agatha and Kathy just to see if there's any comments or questions in the chat for our amazing colleagues here.
I don't see any questions. I do have a comment. Thank you all so much. This has been incredibly vital, not just for me, but for our organization moving forward.
Thank you,
That probably speaks for a lot of folks in the audience.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, and then these last 5 minutes that we have, any last words of wisdom you'd like to share, Sabrina or Liam? Any last mic drop moments you'd like to share with us?
Sabrina?
I mean, really, I think we shared so much information and hopefully wisdom. I don't want to continue reiterating what we've already said, but keep in mind we're here. Create that safe space. Take that first step. Figure out what your organization needs to do to improve. Show that initiative, and keep in mind that you want to do better for the deaf community. And I think really having that motivation and doing something speaks volumes. I can't tell you how much the deaf community appreciates that. And I hope that this information we've shared today is clear. And I also feel that I hope it's been beneficial for everyone. And that you can think about what your next steps are gonna be for your organization, and what you're going to do if you have a deaf survivor shows up, what steps your organization is going to take so that you can provide that access. Because really the goal is to decrease that high rate of violence, DV and SV violence that people experience. And again, this is not only to the state of Colorado, but nationwide to reduce that in general. So I'll turn it over to you, Liam.
Yeah, this is Liam signing. Again, remember, all of you are doing really great and important work. And when we say things as directly as we've said things today, it's because we trust you're listening. You've shown up. As Sabrina said, you showed up here, which says a lot. So to me, I'm assuming people who are here are ready to roll their sleeves up and work with the deaf community and with deaf survivors. So being in a place and creating space where you can name it. So thank you for being here and being open to what we've had to say. And I look forward to your work and continuing to work with deaf communities. It's a journey. It is a journey. And as with any relationship, any journey in any relationship has ups and downs and all the things that come in between. We are all here for the ride, right?
And with that, I want to thank Sabrina and Liam again for having this dialogue with us. And I'm just going to turn it over to Kathy.
And I'll echo Jose Juan's statement. Thank you, Sabrina and Liam. This was wonderful. A lot of great information and a lot of thought for everyone in the audience. I've placed an evaluation in the chat box, and we'd appreciate it if you'd all fill that out, and I will send a follow-up email. And I'd like to remind you that we have another webinar tomorrow with Jose Juan regarding the importance of language access planning. So if you haven't registered, please do so, and we will go over the importance of language access planning and give you some tips on how to do that. And if any of you come up with some questions later, if you'd like to send it to CICASA, then we can get it to Sabrina or Liam or Jose Juan. And thank you to our brilliant interpreters. We appreciate everything you do for us. And if you have any more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending.